At Thanksgiving dinner, my own son pointed at the door and screamed at me to get out. We were sitting at a lavish table surrounded by his wife's wealthy family, and not a single person defended me. They looked at my calloused hands and my faded flannel shirt with pure disgust, thinking I was just a washed-up old man who did not belong in their high society world. He thought it was his moment of absolute triumph. I simply smiled, wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, and said exactly 4 words. My son dropped his crystal wine glass and his face turned the color of ash. Before I tell you how I legally and ruthlessly dismantled his entire life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that respect should never be compromised for the sake of family. I am Solomon, 71 years old, and I built a biochemical waste and logistics empire from the muddy streets of the south side of Chicago. I did not inherit a trust fund, and I did not go to an Ivy League school. I built my net worth to over $100 million by hauling what other people threw away and patenting chemical processes that clean industrial spills. But you would never know it by looking at me. I still drive a 10-year-old truck, I still wear heavy work boots, and I still prefer a quiet, invisible life. My son Julian, on the other hand, is 38 years old and lives entirely for the illusion of wealth. He runs a flashy tech startup that produces nothing but empty promises, and he married Chloe, a woman who comes from a long line of old corporate money. The Thanksgiving dinner was hosted at the sprawling estate of Chloe's parents, Richard and Patricia. The dining room looked like a museum with gold-plated silverware and massive crystal chandeliers. I sat at the far end of the long table, feeling the cold, heavy stares of my in-laws. Patricia kept glancing at my worn-out boots as if I had just tracked toxic mud onto her precious Persian rug. Richard, a ruthless investment banker, swirled his $2,000 wine and spoke over me, entirely acting as if I was not even in the room. Julian sat next to his wife, wearing a tailored Italian suit that I knew he could not afford. He was sweating, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. The tension had been building all evening. Before Julian snapped, the dinner had been a masterclass in high society hostility. Patricia had asked me with a sickeningly sweet voice if my little garbage business was surviving the current economic downturn. I had simply nodded, taking a bite of turkey, and said, "We keep the city clean, Patricia." Chloe had chimed in right after mentioning how Julian was securing a massive round of funding for his tech company. She looked right at me and said that intellectual property was the only real wealth these days, unlike manual labor. They were trying to make me feel incredibly small. They thought I was a fragile blue-collar worker who barely scraped by. They did not know that my biochemical patents were currently being licensed by the federal government, or that my actual net worth completely dwarfed Richard's entire investment portfolio. I kept my massive wealth buried deep because I wanted to see who these people truly were when they thought they held all the power. But Julian was a powder keg waiting to explode. He wanted so desperately to impress Richard, to prove that he belonged in their elite cutthroat circle, that he decided to use his own father as a stepping stone. It started when I reached across the table for a dinner roll. My hands are scarred and rough, deeply stained from decades of working with industrial chemicals and heavy machinery. Patricia let out a small, dramatic gasp and pulled her porcelain plate back slightly. Chloe leaned over and whispered something into Julian's ear, her face twisted in a mocking sneer. Julian slammed his silver fork down onto his plate. The loud clatter made everyone at the table freeze. He glared at me across the expensive floral centerpiece, his eyes filled with a toxic mixture of embarrassment and blind rage. "Look at you," he hissed, his voice trembling with anger. "Just look at you. We are sitting in a multi-million-dollar home and you show up looking like a homeless plumber. You could not even bother to buy a decent suit for one night. You are completely polluting this table." The grand dining room went dead silent. Richard and Patricia did not say a single word to stop him. In fact, Richard leaned back in his heavy leather chair with a faint, amused smile crossing his face, thoroughly enjoying the show. Chloe took a slow sip of her wine, looking at me with absolute contempt. I did not raise my voice. I looked at the boy I had raised, the boy whose entire college tuition I had paid for in cash, and I asked him if my clothes were really the problem tonight. My calm, steady tone only infuriated him more. He stood up from his chair, knocking it backward onto the hardwood floor. His face was flushed a deep, angry red. "Yes, you are the problem," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You have always been the problem. You drag your ghetto mentality everywhere you go. You refuse to elevate yourself. You embarrass me in front of my wife and her parents. I am building a future with real money and real class, and you do not belong in this world. Get out." I sat perfectly still. When Julian stood up and pointed at that door, he was not just trying to kick me out of a dinner party. He was trying to erase his own history. He wanted to amputate the man who had wiped the dirt off his face when he was a child. He wanted to prove to Richard that he was ruthless enough to discard his own blood. "Get out!" Julian screamed again, slamming his open hands down on the table. "Leave this house right now." I did not react with anger. When you have spent 40 years negotiating with corrupt union bosses and ruthless federal contractors, you learn very quickly that screaming is just a glaring sign of weakness. I slowly picked up the white linen napkin from my lap and carefully wiped the corners of my mouth. I placed the napkin neatly next to my plate. I stood up, pushing my chair in with deliberate, quiet precision. I looked at Patricia, who was holding her breath. I looked at Richard, who was still smirking like a predator. And finally, I locked eyes with Julian. He was breathing heavily, puffing his chest out, trying to look like an untouchable, powerful man. He had absolutely no idea he was standing on a trapdoor. I smiled. It was not a warm, fatherly smile. It was the freezing, calculated smile of a predator who had just cornered his prey. "I bought your debt," I said softly. Just 4 words. But those 4 words carried the weight of a nuclear bomb. Julian froze instantly. The blood completely drained from his face, replacing his flushed, arrogant anger with a sickly pale gray. His hand, which was gripping his crystal wine glass, began to shake violently. He knew exactly what I meant. He had been secretly hemorrhaging money for over a year. His flashy tech startup was a complete failure, a dark black hole of unpaid loans and hidden toxic liabilities. The crystal glass slipped from his numb fingers and shattered against the edge of the mahogany table, sending dark red wine spilling across the pristine white tablecloth like a pool of fresh blood. I did not wait for his response. I turned around and grabbed my old, worn-out wool coat from the back of the chair. I walked calmly out of the dining room, my heavy work boots echoing loudly on the hardwood floor. I did not look back as I reached the front door and stepped out into the freezing Chicago winter. As the heavy oak door closed behind me, the silence in that dining room finally broke. I could hear Richard's voice, muffled by the thick walls, but filled with a sudden, terrifying panic. "What debt?" Richard demanded, his voice echoing aggressively. "Julian, what debt is he talking about? What did you do with my money?" I walked to my old truck, pulled my collar up against the biting wind, and started the engine. The Thanksgiving dinner was officially over, but the complete and total destruction of my son's life had just begun. The rain hammered against the rusted roof of my old Ford truck. I sat in the driver's seat, parked under the flickering yellow glow of a solitary street lamp in the back corner of a desolate Walmart parking lot. It was 2 a.m. The temperature was dropping fast, and the cold crept through the floorboards, seeping into my bones. I was 71 years old, and my entire life had just been packed into a single duffel bag resting on the passenger seat. Just a few hours ago, the county sheriff had knocked on my front door. Standing right behind the officers were my son Julian and his wife Victoria. They stood there with their arms crossed, their faces completely devoid of any guilt or hesitation. The officers handed me an eviction notice. My house, the home where I raised Julian, the home I had paid off 20 years ago, was being seized by the bank. I remember looking at Julian, waiting for him to explain, waiting for him to tell the police there was a misunderstanding. But he just looked away. Victoria, however, looked me dead in the eye and smirked. As I walked out into the freezing rain, she leaned in close and whispered that I should look for a bed at the downtown homeless shelter because I no longer had a place in their world. But sitting in the freezing cabin of my truck, I did not shed a single tear. Crying is for people who accept defeat. Crying is for people who do not know how to fight back. I reached into my canvas duffel bag and pulled out a battered leather briefcase. They thought I was just a tired old man. Julian thought I was a naive, blue-collar relic who spent his life fixing pipes and mowing lawns. Victoria thought I was an uneducated burden who was entirely illiterate when it came to modern finance. They completely forgot who I really was. They forgot that before I retired, I spent 30 years working as a senior forensic inspector for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. For 3 decades, my entire job was to walk into failing banks, rip open their corporate ledgers, and hunt down the corrupt executives who were hiding stolen money. I did not just read financial documents, I interrogated them. I turned on the dim dome light of the truck. The pale yellow light illuminated the interior. I pulled the wet, crumpled copies of the foreclosure notice and the mortgage contract out of the briefcase and spread them across the steering wheel. I needed to understand how they took my house. I looked at the signature line on the master collateral agreement. There it was. My own signature shaky but undeniably authentic. I closed my eyes and the memory from a month ago hit me like a physical blow. Julian had come to visit me acting incredibly stressed and in a massive hurry. I was sitting in my armchair recovering from a bad bout of the flu. I did not have my reading glasses on. Julian had placed a thick stack of papers on my lap telling me they were standard Medicare update forms for my upcoming medical coverage. He pointed exactly where I needed to sign, telling me I had to do it quickly before the insurance deadline expired. I trusted my son. I signed the papers. But I was not signing medical forms. I was signing a blanket collateral guarantee putting my entire estate up as the sacrificial lamb for a massive corporate loan. I opened my eyes and leaned closer to the documents. The emotional pain of my son's betrayal washed over me, but I pushed it down deep into the pit of my stomach. Emotion makes you blind, and I needed to see clearly. I put on my reading glasses and began to dissect the contract. I ignored the dense legal jargon and went straight for the structural anatomy of the loan. I looked at the routing numbers, the authorization stamps, and the chronological dates. That is where the rats always leave their footprints. The principal amount of the loan was $4 million. That number immediately set off a warning bell in my head. Julian ran a flashy tech startup, but it was a small operation. His company was struggling, but it was not $4 million in debt. A startup of his size could not even absorb that much liquid capital without triggering massive tax audits. The money was far too large for his business. It had to be for something else. I traced my calloused finger down to the final page of the contract where the legal authorization was finalized. I squinted at a small circular stamp placed at the very bottom corner of the page. The ink was slightly faded, but my eyes caught the name pressed inside the seal. Preston Gallagher. My heart skipped a beat. The air in the truck suddenly felt incredibly thin. Victoria, my arrogant, elitist daughter-in-law, had a maiden name. Gallagher. Preston was her older brother. I kept tracing the documents, cross-referencing the letterhead of the bank that issued the $4 million. It was a regional commercial bank based in downtown Chicago. My memory snapped perfectly into place. Preston Gallagher was the vice president of commercial lending at that exact same bank. I sat back against the cold vinyl seat and let out a low, dark breath. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together, forming a picture of absolute corruption. A bank vice president had personally notarized and approved a massive commercial loan for his own brother-in-law using a blind, elderly father as the collateral guarantor. That was not just a conflict of interest. That was a massive, blatant violation of federal banking regulations. It was a felony that carried a mandatory prison sentence. But why would Preston risk his lucrative career and his freedom to authorize a highly illegal loan for Julian? My mind raced back to Victoria. I thought about her background. She was a woman who demanded luxury. She lived for country clubs, designer clothes, and social dominance. Until 6 months ago, she had worked as the chief financial officer for a very wealthy private healthcare network. Then out of nowhere, she abruptly resigned, claiming she wanted to take time off to support Julian's startup. It made no sense at the time. She was obsessed with her corporate status. Then the truth hit me with the force of a freight train. The $4 million was never for Julian's business. Victoria had been embezzling funds from the healthcare network to fund her lavish lifestyle. The walls must have been closing in on her. She knew an external audit was coming and she was completely desperate. She needed a massive injection of clean, untraceable cash to silently replace the stolen money before the board of directors noticed it was missing. Julian did not trick me into signing away my house to build his empire. He threw his own father to the wolves to keep his wealthy white wife out of a federal penitentiary. They used my clean, debt-free estate to secure the loan, and Preston used his executive power to bypass the bank's risk assessment algorithms and push the dirty money through the system. They thought they had committed the perfect crime. They thought I would just wander into a homeless shelter and slowly die of a broken heart, entirely ignorant of what they had done. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they left a blazing paper trail of federal crimes right in front of a man who spent his entire life putting corrupt bankers behind bars. A cold, ruthless energy flooded my veins. The betrayal no longer hurt. It just fueled the fire. If the federal authorities saw this connection, Julian, Victoria, and Preston would all face decades in a maximum security prison for wire fraud, bank fraud, and elder abuse. But a blurred copy of a foreclosure notice was not enough to trigger an FBI raid. I knew exactly how the federal system worked. Prosecutors do not move without bulletproof evidence. I needed the original loan origination documents. I needed the internal bank routing numbers and the digital signature logs that Preston manipulated inside the bank server. I needed the hard evidence of where that $4 million was actually wired. I looked out the rain-streaked windshield of my truck. The scared, broken old man who was kicked out of his home an hour ago was completely dead. The federal inspector was back on the clock. I folded the documents and placed them carefully back into my leather briefcase. I reached down and turned the key in the ignition. The old Ford engine roared to life, rumbling steadily in the cold night. I put the truck in gear and pulled out of the empty parking lot. I was not going to a shelter. I was going to hunt. And I was going to tear their pristine, perfect world completely to the ground. The sun came up over the Walmart parking lot, casting a gray, miserable light through the rain-streaked windows of my old Ford truck. My bones ached from sleeping on the cold vinyl seat, but my mind was completely wide awake. I was staring at the dashboard clock when my cell phone finally buzzed. I looked at the screen. It was Julian. I let it ring 4 times before I answered. I needed to sound exhausted. I needed to sound completely broken. I cleared my throat, letting a raspy, weak sound escape my lips, and answered the call. Julian did not ask how I was. He did not ask if I had frozen to death in the storm. He went straight into his performance. "Dad," he said, his voice dripping with fake, heavily rehearsed sympathy. "I am so sorry about last night. Victoria was out of line, but you have to understand the pressure we are under. The bank moved too fast. I tried to stop them, but my hands were tied. I sat in the freezing truck, gripping the steering wheel. The audacity was almost impressive. He was trying to play the victim of his own crime. I kept my voice shaky, playing the part of the confused old man. I asked him where I was supposed to go. I told him I had nothing left." Julian sighed deeply, acting like a savior descending from the heavens. "Listen to me, Dad. I found a place for you. It is a small apartment out in the south suburbs. It is not much, but I will pay the first 6 months of rent out of my own pocket. I will keep a roof over your head. But there is a catch. The legal team at the startup needs you to sign a standard liability waiver just stating that you understand the foreclosure was a banking issue and not a personal family matter. A liability waiver. He was offering me a rundown, roach-infested apartment on the outskirts of the city in exchange for total legal immunity. He wanted me to sign away my right to sue him or report the fraud to the federal authorities. I let out a pathetic, trembling sob. I told him I just needed a warm bed. I told him I would sign whatever he needed. He told me to meet him at a high-end coffee shop downtown in 1 hour. I hung up the phone and the trembling instantly stopped. My tears dried up completely. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a digital micro-recorder from my days as a federal inspector. I clipped it to the inside pocket of my heavy wool coat right over my heart. I walked into the coffee shop exactly 1 hour later. It was filled with wealthy businessmen in tailored suits sipping overpriced lattes. Julian was sitting at a corner table wearing a cashmere sweater and tapping nervously on his brand-new smartphone. When he saw me walk in, his nose wrinkled in pure disgust. I was wearing the same damp flannel shirt and heavy work boots from the night before. I shuffled over to the table, keeping my head bowed down. I did not sit until he gestured to the chair. He did not offer to buy me a coffee. He just slid a thick manila folder across the marble table along with an expensive silver pen. "Sign the back page, Dad," Julian said, his voice completely devoid of any warmth. "Once you sign it, I will hand you the keys to the apartment and you can take a bus out there this afternoon." I looked down at the legal document. It was a masterpiece of corporate shielding. It explicitly stated that I absolved Julian Victoria and the lending bank of any predatory practices regarding the $4 million loan. If my ink touched that paper, I would legally legitimize their entire embezzlement scheme. I picked up the silver pen, letting my hand shake violently. I looked up at my son with wide, terrified eyes. I needed him to brag. I needed his ego to do the talking for him. I whispered to him that I was scared. I asked him what would happen if the federal regulators looked into the loan. I told him I used to work for the government and that moving $4 million against a residential property was going to trigger a massive audit. I begged him to tell me we were not going to federal prison. Julian let out a short, arrogant laugh. He leaned across the table, looking at me with pure, condescending pity. "You have been retired for a decade, old man," he sneered. "The financial world does not work the way you think it does anymore. You are playing checkers while we are playing chess. Nobody is going to prison." I leaned in closer, pretending to be completely desperate for reassurance. I asked him how he could be so sure. I asked him how he got the money out of the bank so quickly without raising any red flags at the Federal Reserve. Julian could not resist. He could never resist showing off how smart he thought he was. "Dad," he whispered, leaning right into the hidden microphone under my coat. Preston is the vice president of commercial lending. His bank legitimized everything. He bypassed the algorithmic risk assessment. He manually authorized the funds and pushed the collateral through the system under a corporate exemption shell. We washed the money clean before the sun came up. Suing me is entirely useless. Going to the police is useless. Preston controls the internal audit committee. The money is gone. The paper trail is buried, and you are just an old man with a bad memory who signed a contract he did not read. Sign the waiver and take the apartment because this is the only lifeline you are ever going to get. I looked at the smug, arrogant face of my only son. He had just confessed to federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and criminal conspiracy all into a highly sensitive digital recorder. I had the bulletproof evidence I needed. I slowly put the silver pen down on the table. I did not sign the paper. I looked him dead in the eye and the fragile old man routine completely vanished. My posture straightened. I told him to keep his cheap apartment. I stood up from the table, leaving the unsigned waiver sitting next to his empty coffee cup. Julian shouted my name as I walked out the glass doors, but I did not stop. The cold wind hit my face as I stepped onto the busy Chicago sidewalk. I felt a surge of absolute power knowing the digital recorder in my pocket held the key to destroying their entire empire. I reached into my pocket to turn off the device, but my trained federal instincts suddenly kicked in. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced at the reflection in a dark store window. Two massive men in heavy black leather jackets were standing across the street staring directly at me. One of them pulled out a phone and spoke into it, never taking his eyes off my face. Julian was arrogant, but Preston Gallagher was a highly dangerous man protecting $4 million of stolen money. I realized instantly that they were not just trying to buy my silence. They had sent muscle to ensure I never spoke again. The game had just escalated to a matter of life and death. At Thanksgiving dinner, my own son pointed at the door and screamed at me to get out. We were sitting at a lavish table surrounded by his wife's wealthy family, and not a single person defended me. They looked at my calloused hands and my faded flannel shirt with pure disgust, thinking I was just a washed-up old man who did not belong in their high society world. He thought it was his moment of absolute triumph. I simply smiled, wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, and said exactly 4 words. My son dropped his crystal wine glass, and his face turned the color of ash. Before I tell you how I legally and ruthlessly dismantled his entire life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that respect should never be compromised for the sake of family. The cold wind whipped down the Chicago street, but I did not run. Running tells the predator you are prey. I kept my pace steady and my head facing forward. I could hear the heavy boots of the 2 men in leather jackets staying exactly 30 paces behind me. They were professionals, but they were sloppy. I had spent 30 years tracking white-collar criminals who hired goons just like them to intimidate federal auditors. I knew exactly how to make them disappear. I turned a sharp corner and walked straight down the concrete stairs into the underground subway station. The smell of ozone and damp earth hit me immediately. The platform was crowded with midday commuters. I slid an old transit card through the turnstile and merged right into the thickest part of the crowd. I stood near the edge of the platform listening to the low rumble of an approaching train. The 2 men pushed through the turnstiles, their eyes scanning the sea of faces. When the train doors slid open, I stepped inside, but I did not stay. I moved straight across the carriage and stepped right back out the opposite doors, just as the warning chime sounded. The heavy metal doors snapped shut, trapping the 2 goons inside the train as it pulled away into the dark tunnel. I was clear, but I knew my time was running out. I walked back up to the street level completely undetected. Having the audio confession on my digital recorder was a massive victory, but it was not the final bullet. Federal prosecutors require a flawless chain of custody. I needed the original physical loan documents from the bank, the exact papers bearing my forged signature and Preston Gallagher's authorization stamp. But I was a 71-year-old man carrying a duffel bag. I could not just walk through the front doors of a highly secure commercial bank and ask to browse their restricted archives. I needed an insider. I needed someone on the payroll who was desperate enough to cross the line. I walked 3 blocks to the massive glass high-rise that housed Preston's bank. I stood across the street in the shadow of a bus stop pretending to read a newspaper. I watched the front lobby through the towering floor-to-ceiling windows. I was looking for a vulnerability. An hour passed before I saw him. Preston Gallagher walked into the lobby wearing a pristine, tailored suit holding a cup of expensive coffee. But he was not alone. He was cornering a young African-American woman dressed in a modest business skirt. Her name badge hung heavily on her chest. She was clutching a stack of credit files, looking absolutely terrified. I watched as Preston berated her right in the middle of the crowded lobby. He pointed his finger in her face, completely ignoring the employees walking past them. He threw a red file folder onto the marble floor, forcing her to bend down and pick it up. The sheer humiliation radiating from the scene was sickening. I could read his body language perfectly. He was not just yelling at an employee, he was actively building a narrative. He was publicly establishing her incompetence so he could use her as a scapegoat later. When Preston finally walked away, the young woman stood there wiping a single tear from her cheek before rushing toward the employee exit. I had found my way inside. I followed her to the adjacent parking garage. The concrete structure was dim and echoed with the sound of distant traffic. She walked quickly toward a modest, compact car, fumbling with her keys. She was shaking, clearly overwhelmed by the brutal public dressing down she had just endured. I stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. I kept my hands visible and spoke in a low, calm voice so I would not startle her. I told her name was Maya Jackson. I told her she was a junior credit officer and that she was currently being framed for a massive financial crime she did not commit. Maya froze. She dropped her keys onto the concrete floor and looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. She asked me who I was and how I knew her name. I did not give her my name. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of notebook paper. Over the last 2 hours, sitting in a quiet diner, I had written out a complete structural breakdown of how corrupt bank executives isolate toxic loans. I handed the paper to her. I told her to look at the numbers. I told her that Preston Gallagher was manually routing his most dangerous high-risk commercial loans through her specific employee identification terminal. I explained that when the federal auditors finally came to investigate the missing millions, Preston was going to claim that a junior credit officer made a catastrophic series of unauthorized approvals. I told her she was being set up to take the fall for a federal bank fraud charge that carried a 20-year mandatory prison sentence. Maya stared at the handwritten numbers. The blood completely drained from her face. She was a smart girl. She knew the banking system well enough to realize that the math I handed her was absolutely flawless. She looked up at me, her voice trembling. She asked me why I was telling her this and what I wanted from her. I told her I wanted the man who was trying to destroy her. I explained that Preston had just authorized a fraudulent $4 million loan under the name Julian. I told her that loan was secured against my personal home using a forged signature. I looked her dead in the eye and offered her a deal. I told her that if she used her security clearance to go down into the restricted physical archives and smuggle out the original hard copies of Julian's loan file, I would hand over the audio recordings and the forensic evidence I had collected. I promised her that I would give her the exact ammunition she needed to send Preston to a federal penitentiary and clear her own name completely. Maya stood shivering in the cold, damp air of the parking garage. She looked at the paper in her hand and then back at me. I could see the massive internal struggle tearing her apart. She was a good person who had played by the rules her entire life. She went to college, got a respectable job, and tried to build a career. Now she was standing in a concrete box, realizing that the rules were completely rigged against her. She knew if she got caught stealing restricted corporate documents, she would be arrested immediately. But she also knew that if she did nothing, Preston was going to feed her to the federal wolves anyway. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say a single word, a loud, sharp buzzing sound echoed through the quiet garage. It was coming from her uniform pocket. She pulled out her company-issued pager and looked at the small digital screen. I watched her eyes widen in sheer, absolute panic. Her hand began to shake so violently she almost dropped the device. I stepped closer and asked her what the message said. Maya swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. She told me the message was directly from Preston. He was ordering her to stay late after the bank closed tonight. He instructed her to go down to the basement archives and permanently shred all the original hard copies of the $4 million loan file connected to Julian. He told her it was a routine document purge and that she had to finish the job before midnight. The trap was closing. Preston knew I was out on the streets. He knew I had the audio recording from the coffee shop. He was panicking. He was trying to erase the physical paper trail before I could get to the authorities, and he was using Maya to do his dirty work. If she shredded those documents, the only concrete proof of the forgery would be turned into confetti, and she would become an active accessory to the destruction of federal evidence. I looked at Maya. She was no longer just a frightened employee. She was a woman staring right down the barrel of a loaded gun. I told her we were completely out of time. I told her if those documents were destroyed tonight, Julian and Preston would walk away with my home and she would go to prison for the rest of her life. I asked her if she was ready to fight back. She looked at the pager, then looked at me and gave a single determined nod. The clock was officially ticking. We had less than 10 hours to pull off a flawless heist inside a highly secure commercial bank. The city of Chicago never truly sleeps, but the financial district becomes an absolute ghost town after midnight. I stood in the freezing alley behind the towering glass structure of Preston's commercial bank, blending perfectly into the deep shadows of a commercial dumpster. I pulled the collar of my heavy wool coat up against the biting wind and pressed a cheap disposable walkie-talkie to my ear. Maya was already inside the building. She had used her employee key card to bypass the lobby security right before the midnight shift change, exactly as we had planned. We had timed this operation down to the precise second. I pressed the transmission button and asked her for a status update. Her voice came back through the static, trembling slightly but filled with absolute unwavering resolve. She told me she had successfully reached the restricted basement archives. She was standing right in front of the master server terminal where the digital backups of all high-risk commercial loans were kept securely locked away from regular employees. I told her to breathe deeply and focus her mind. I had spent 30 years tearing apart bank mainframes exactly like this one for the federal government. I knew their architecture better than the men who designed them. I walked her through the command sequence, instructing her to bypass the standard employee portal and access the raw data directory using an old developer backdoor that banks rarely bothered to close. She typed the commands with the desperate speed of a woman fighting for her life and her freedom. Everything was going perfectly smoothly until the digital trap suddenly snapped shut. I heard a sharp intake of breath over the radio, followed by a rapid clicking of keyboard keys. Maya whispered frantically that the computer screen had just changed completely. She told me she had located the specific encrypted folder holding the $4 million loan origination documents tied to Julian and my forged signature. She plugged the small encrypted USB drive I had given her into the terminal port and initiated the forced download sequence. But the transfer progress bar did not move a single inch. Instead, the entire computer monitor flashed a brilliant warning red that bathed the dark basement room in a harsh, bloody light. A loud, automated voice echoed through the archive room announcing an unauthorized security breach protocol. My blood ran completely cold in the freezing alleyway. Preston was an incredibly arrogant man, but he was not entirely stupid. He knew he had committed a massive federal crime by pushing that fraudulent money through the banking system to cover his sister's embezzlement. He had placed a highly sensitive internal tripwire directly on his brother-in-law's specific loan file. Anyone who tried to access those highly restricted documents without his personal executive clearance would immediately trigger a silent alarm that routed directly to his personal phone and the building security desk. Over the open radio channel, I could hear the heavy thud of tactical combat boots echoing loudly down the concrete stairwell. The night guards were mobilizing fast. Then I heard something much worse that made my stomach drop. I heard Preston's voice shouting aggressive orders from the upper landing. He had not gone home to his luxury penthouse. He had stayed late in the building, probably trying to cover his tracks and waiting to see if anyone would take the bait. He was demanding the security guards lock down the elevators and seal the heavy steel basement archive doors. Maya began to panic completely. She was crying into the radio, telling me they were coming down the stairs and that the main reinforced door was the only way out of the secure server room. I told her to stop crying and listen to me very carefully. I had studied the architectural blueprints of this commercial bank for 3 hours at a local diner. I knew there was a secondary exit that an arrogant executive like Preston would completely overlook. I told her to look up at the ceiling in the far back right corner of the room. There was a large industrial ventilation shaft designed to cool the massive heat generated by the server racks. I ordered her to pull a rolling desk chair to the corner, kick out the aluminum grate, and climb inside the duct before the armed guards breached the door. I listened to the chaotic sounds of a heist falling apart coming through the open microphone. I heard the heavy steel door of the archive room rattle violently as the guards swiped their override cards and tried to break the electronic lock. I heard Maya grunting with physical effort as she pulled her body weight up into the dusty metallic confines of the ventilation system. Just as she kicked the heavy metal grate back into place, the archive door burst wide open with a massive crash. I could hear Preston screaming furiously into the room, demanding to know who was at the terminal and where the intruder had gone. He was cursing and ordering the guards to search every single inch of the basement. But Maya was already crawling through the dark, narrow metal tunnel, moving inch by inch over their heads. I guided her through the confusing maze of ductwork, telling her to take the second left branch that led directly toward the exterior exhaust port overlooking the back alley where I was standing. The metal groaned and echoed terribly under her weight, but she kept moving forward, driven by pure, unadulterated survival instinct. She knew if they caught her, she would go to federal prison for the rest of her life. 2 agonizing minutes later, I heard the distinct sound of a metal latch popping open exactly 20 feet above my head. I looked up into the freezing rain and saw the dark silhouette of her hands pushing the heavy exhaust grate aside. She leaned her head out into the cold night air, panting heavily. I stepped out of the shadows and whispered into the radio, telling her to drop the drive immediately. A small silver object tumbled through the dark, rainy alley and landed perfectly into my waiting hands. I gripped the cold metal USB drive tightly in my fist. It contained the exact digital signatures, the internal bank routing numbers, and the absolute undisputed proof of their federal crimes. I had the final bullet that would destroy their entire perfect world and send all 3 of them to a concrete cell. I spoke into the radio one last time, telling Maya to keep crawling toward the adjacent parking structure and to disappear into the city crowd until I contacted her. I pocketed the silver drive and turned around to walk toward the main avenue to hail a cab. But before I could take a single step forward, a blinding pair of halogen high-beam headlights flared to life at the far end of the narrow brick alleyway. A heavy black sedan revved its massive engine, the roaring sound echoing violently off the narrow concrete walls. It was the 2 massive men in black leather jackets. They had not lost my trail at the subway station. They had anticipated my move and waited for me in the dark. The tires screeched aggressively against the wet pavement, burning rubber as the massive car launched forward. The vehicle accelerated to a lethal speed, charging straight at me in the dark, confined alley with absolutely nowhere for me to run. The blinding halogen headlights filled the narrow brick alleyway. The heavy engine roared like a caged beast. I had less than 2 seconds to make a decision that would determine if I lived to see the morning. I did not freeze. 30 years of dealing with cornered, desperate men teaches you that hesitation equals death. I threw my body violently to the right, diving behind the rusted bulk of an industrial dumpster just as the black sedan tore through the space where I had been standing. The heavy steel bumper scraped against the brick wall, sending a shower of orange sparks into the freezing rain. The side mirror clipped my left arm, tearing through my heavy wool coat and ripping the skin underneath. I hit the wet pavement hard, but I kept my right fist tightly clenched around the silver USB drive. The car screeched to a halt at the end of the alley, and I heard the transmission slam into reverse. They were coming back to finish the job. But before they could accelerate, a blaring police siren echoed down the main avenue. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the wet asphalt. The driver of the sedan cursed loudly, hit the gas, and tore out of the alley, disappearing into the Chicago night. I laid there in the freezing mud, breathing heavily, my arm throbbing with a sharp, burning pain. But I was alive. And more importantly, I had the data. I pulled myself up from the ground, ignoring the blood dripping down my sleeve. I stayed in the shadows, keeping off the main streets until I reached my old Ford truck parked a few blocks away. I climbed into the cold cabin, locked the doors, and started the engine. Preston Gallagher knew the data was gone. He knew his digital vault had been breached. He would have his goons tearing the city apart looking for me before the sun came up. I could not stay anywhere near downtown. I drove for 45 minutes, heading deep into the south suburbs until I found a rundown cash-only motel sitting off a desolate stretch of highway. It was the kind of place where nobody asked for your name and nobody looked you in the eye. I paid the tired clerk with a crumpled $100 bill and walked into room number 12. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap bleach. I took off my torn coat and walked into the cramped bathroom. I washed the deep gash on my arm in the stained sink, letting the freezing water clear away the dirt and blood. I wrapped the wound tightly with a ripped hotel towel. The physical pain was sharp, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the cold, burning focus taking over my mind. Preston had escalated this from a silent financial theft to an attempted murder. The gloves were completely off. I sat down at the rickety wooden desk by the window and pulled my battered laptop from my canvas duffel bag. This computer was completely untraceable, heavily encrypted, and stripped of any commercial tracking software. I booted it up and plugged the silver USB drive into the port. My heart beat steadily as the screen illuminated the dark room. For 3 decades, I walked into the most secure banking institutions in this country and tore their ledgers to shreds. I knew exactly how corrupt executives hid their dirty money. They used digital smoke and mirrors. They used complex routing numbers and dummy corporations to make the funds look like legitimate business expenses. But numbers do not lie. Numbers leave a permanent footprint if you know exactly where to look. I opened the master file containing the $4 million loan origination documents. There it was. My forged signature scanned and approved by Preston Gallagher. I bypassed the standard summary pages and went straight into the raw transactional data. I needed to see exactly where the $4 million went after it left the bank. I traced the primary wire transfer. The digital logs showed the money moving into a holding account registered to Julian's tech startup, but it did not stay there for more than 10 minutes. The funds were immediately split. The first chunk of money, exactly $2 million, was wired directly into the master operating accounts of the private healthcare network where Victoria used to work as the chief financial officer. That confirmed my initial theory completely. Victoria had embezzled $2 million to fund her lavish country club lifestyle, and they used the fraudulent loan taken out against my house to quietly replace the stolen funds before the corporate board noticed it was missing. They had effectively covered her tracks and saved her from a massive prison sentence. But as I stared at the glowing computer screen, my brow furrowed in deep confusion. The math was fundamentally wrong. The original loan was for $4 million. If $2 million went to the healthcare network, where did the other half go? I flexed my fingers and started digging much deeper into the encrypted ledger. I followed the digital trail of the remaining $2 million. Preston had tried to bury the transaction behind a massive labyrinth of corporate shell entities. He routed the money through a phantom logistics firm in Delaware, then washed it through a blind trust in Nevada. It was a highly sophisticated obfuscation tactic designed to fool standard tax auditors. But I was not a standard auditor. I was a senior forensic inspector, and I knew how to peel back the layers of a corporate onion. It took me 2 hours of relentless tracing, but I finally broke through the last firewall. I found the final destination of the remaining $2 million. The money had crossed international borders. It was wired directly into a private, highly secure offshore bank account located in the Cayman Islands. I ran a cross-reference check on the anonymous offshore routing number using an old federal database access code I had memorized years ago. The account holder name flashed across my screen and the breath caught completely in my throat. The offshore account belonged to Preston Gallagher. The sheer magnitude of the corruption hit me like a physical shockwave. This was not just a case of a wealthy bank executive breaking the rules to save his sister from an embezzlement charge. Preston Gallagher had used his own sister's desperate criminal crisis as an opportunity to steal $2 million for himself. He had authorized the fraudulent loan against my property, covered Victoria's tracks, and then quietly pocketed half the cash, washing it through international borders to enrich his own offshore portfolio. That changed the entire game. This was no longer just a family dispute or a simple case of localized bank fraud. By crossing international borders with stolen funds, Preston had officially committed federal money laundering. He had just triggered the jurisdiction of the most ruthless federal agencies in the country. A cold, dark smile spread across my face in the dim motel room. Julian and Victoria thought they had outsmarted a naive old man. Preston thought he had committed the perfect, untraceable crime. They had absolutely no idea that I was holding the exact financial coordinates to send all 3 of them to a federal penitentiary for the next 30 years. I closed the laptop. The hunt had officially escalated, and I was holding all the ammunition. I stare at the cracked screen of my burner laptop inside the dingy motel room. The cheap fluorescent light hummed above my head, but my focus was entirely locked on the digital file Maya had just forwarded to me. She had intercepted an electronic invitation from Julian's corporate email server. The invitation was sleek minimalist and dripping with the kind of pretentious elite arrogance that only Victoria could design. They were throwing a massive, lavish celebration party tomorrow evening. But it was not at a high-end downtown restaurant or an exclusive country club. It was at my house. The exact same house I had paid off with 30 years of sweat, blood, and exhaustive labor. The invitation boldly called it a farewell to the past networking event. They were not just foreclosing on my property to cover their fraudulent tracks. They had finalized a backdoor deal with a massive commercial real estate conglomerate to completely bulldoze my home next week. They were planning to sell the raw prime land for a massive commercial development project. They were actually going to throw a party, hire an expensive catering team, drink imported champagne, and celebrate the literal demolition of my entire life. The sheer, unadulterated disrespect burned in my chest like a physical fire. They thought the old man was currently sleeping on a cold park bench, completely broken and defeated by their superior intellect. They thought they had buried me under a mountain of legal paperwork and corporate manipulation. They did not know I was sitting in the dark, meticulously sharpening the blade of their execution. I picked up my secure burner phone. I did not call the local Chicago Police Department. Local cops do not understand the complex digital plumbing of international money laundering, and Preston Gallagher had enough local political influence to bury any standard police investigation before it even started. I needed the heavy artillery. I needed the ghosts of my past. I dialed a direct encrypted telephone number to Washington, D.C. The phone rang exactly twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered the line. It was Director Robert Stanton, the current head of the Regional Enforcement Division for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Robert and I had spent the late 90s kicking down the mahogany doors of corrupt savings and loans executives across the entire Midwest. He was a man who lived and breathed federal financial regulations, and he owed his current high-ranking career to the forensic frameworks I had built. I did not waste his time with pleasantries or personal updates. I told Robert I had a massive verified Level 5 bank fraud actively bleeding out of a highly respected regional commercial bank in downtown Chicago. I outlined the anatomy of the crime with absolute surgical precision. I told him a vice president of commercial lending named Preston Gallagher had manually bypassed the bank's algorithmic risk assessments. He pushed a fraudulent $4 million commercial loan through the system using a forged residential collateral deed containing my signature. I explained how the funds were immediately split to cover an active corporate embezzlement crisis. Then I dropped the heaviest bomb. I told Robert that $2 million of that federally insured money had already been washed clean through a Delaware shell company and wired directly into an anonymous offshore Cayman Islands account owned by Preston himself. Robert went completely dead silent on the other end of the line. When you mention Cayman Island wire transfers and executive-level forgery to an FDIC director, you are ringing the ultimate federal alarm bell. Robert asked me if my forensic math was absolutely bulletproof. He asked if I had the physical digital footprints to back up these massive allegations. I told him I had the raw data, the digital signature logs, and the exact international routing numbers sitting on a highly encrypted flash drive right in my hand. I told him Preston Gallagher was treating the American federal banking system like his own personal piggy bank to save his arrogant sister from a 20-year embezzlement sentence. Robert let out a long, heavy sigh that sounded like a coming storm. He told me the evidence I had just described was more than enough to completely destroy Preston Gallagher. He promised me he would personally authorize a massive federal surprise audit at the bank first thing Monday morning. He said a highly trained team of 30 federal examiners would walk through those glass doors, lock down the master servers, freeze every single terminal, and have Preston in federal handcuffs before his morning coffee even got cold. The bank would be gutted, and the corrupt executives would be dragged out into the daylight. But then Robert gave me the hard, brutal truth of the federal justice system. He told me that while the bank data was more than enough to crucify Preston, it was not enough to instantly freeze the personal assets of Julian and Victoria. They had cleverly layered their involvement behind multiple corporate veils and plausible deniability. Julian could easily claim he just signed a standard business loan organized by his bank, and Victoria could claim she had absolutely no knowledge of her brother's offshore activities. They would play the victims. Robert told me that if I wanted the Department of Justice to freeze their personal accounts and arrest them alongside Preston, I needed undeniable physical proof that Julian and Victoria were actively and knowingly participating in the money laundering process on American soil. I needed to catch them holding the dirty money or executing a corrupt financial transaction in real time. Without that smoking gun, they would use their stolen millions to hire a team of elite defense lawyers and drag the federal case out for a decade while continuing to live their lavish lifestyle. I thanked Robert and hung up the phone. I looked back at the digital invitation glowing brightly on my laptop screen. My mind raced, connecting the final desperate dots of their plan. Why were they rushing to demolish the house next week? Why host a massive networking party right now in the middle of a major financial crisis? The answer was incredibly simple and entirely corrupt. The real estate conglomerate was not just buying the land through standard channels. Julian and Victoria were completely locked out of the digital banking system because of Preston's offshore moves. They needed clean, untraceable cash to finalize their exit strategy. The conglomerate was funneling the final illicit kickback payment to Julian through a physical bearer bond exchange. They were going to execute the final stage of the money laundering operation tomorrow night, right in the middle of their arrogant celebration. They were going to use the loud music, the expensive catering, and the crowded rooms to mask a high-level criminal transaction inside the very house they stole from me. I closed the laptop and grabbed my heavy wool coat. I did not have a federal badge anymore, but I had something much more dangerous. I had a lifetime of forensic knowledge, and I had absolutely nothing left to lose. They wanted to throw a massive party to celebrate my destruction, so I was going to attend. I was going to walk right back into the lion's den tomorrow night, and I was going to catch them with their hands covered in dirty money. They thought they had successfully erased me from their perfect world, but they were about to learn that the ghosts of the past never stay buried. I was going to burn their entire pristine empire to ashes, and I was going to make sure they watched it happen. I stood by the window of my cheap motel room looking out through the dirty glass at the parking lot below. The morning sky was gray and heavy with freezing rain, but the weather was not what held my attention. My old Ford truck, the vehicle I had driven for over a decade, the truck that helped me build my entire biochemical logistics empire from the ground up, was completely destroyed. Every single window was shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces of glass. The heavy-duty tires were slashed into useless ribbons of rubber, and the solid steel hood was caved in by what looked like a dozen brutal blows from a heavy sledgehammer. Preston Gallagher had sent his men in the middle of the night. They had tracked my movements and found my location, but they did not come up to my room to finish the job. They wanted to send a very specific message. They wanted to show me that they could reach out and crush my physical life at any moment they chose. They thought seeing my beloved truck reduced to worthless scrap metal would finally break my spirit and send me running out of Chicago for good. But they made a massive, arrogant miscalculation. Destroying a piece of metal does not scare a man who has already faced the absolute worst betrayal from his own flesh and blood. It only confirms that the enemy is absolutely terrified of what is coming next. I turned away from the window and put on my heavy wool coat. The truck was gone, but my legs worked just fine and my mind was sharper than it had been in 30 years. I walked 2 miles down the freezing highway, keeping my head down against the biting wind until I reached a quiet roadside diner. Maya was already sitting in a back booth wearing a dark hooded jacket and nervously stirring a cup of black coffee. She looked completely exhausted with dark circles under her eyes, but her posture held a fierce, undeniable determination. She had risked her entire life pulling that digital data from the highly secure bank archive, and now she was fully committed to the war we were fighting. I sat down across from her and laid out the reality of our current situation. I told her the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was going to raid the bank with a massive team of 30 agents on Monday morning, but we needed to catch Julian and Victoria actively touching the dirty money tonight. Maya nodded and pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket. She had spent the entire night reviewing the internal wire transfer protocols she stole from Preston's restricted server. She explained that Preston had set up a delayed digital routing sequence. The final $2 million, the money Julian and Victoria desperately needed to completely walk away clean, was currently sitting in a temporary holding account. Preston had to manually release those funds to an anonymous offshore Cayman Islands shell company, and he needed Julian's physical digital signature token to authorize the final jump. I told Maya they were going to execute that exact transfer tonight right in the middle of their lavish farewell party at my old house. We needed to be inside that house when the digital ink dried. Maya said she could monitor the bank's remote server access from a laptop, but we needed a way to force them into making a panicked mistake. I opened my secure burner laptop right there in the diner booth. Maya had pulled up Victoria's public social media accounts. The sheer elite arrogance radiating from the glowing screen was absolutely nauseating. Victoria had just posted a high-definition video of herself standing in my front yard wearing a designer winter coat and holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne. In the video, she was smiling brightly and talking about her grand vision for the future. She proudly announced to her thousands of wealthy followers that she and Julian were hosting a massive networking gala tonight to celebrate the upcoming demolition of this historical property. She called my home a dilapidated relic of the past that needed to be aggressively bulldozed to make way for a state-of-the-art commercial wellness center. She was standing on the exact spot where I used to play catch with Julian when he was a little boy, and she was publicly bragging about tearing it all down to build a vanity project funded entirely by embezzled money and federal bank fraud. She had absolutely no respect for the blood and sweat that went into the concrete foundation of that house. She only saw dirt that she could turn into gold for her wealthy friends. I watched the video twice, feeling a cold, calculated rage settle deep into my bones. They were throwing a lavish party on my grave. I decided it was time to let the dead speak. I needed to push Julian into a state of total, absolute panic. A calm criminal is a careful criminal, but a terrified criminal makes catastrophic, unforced errors. I accessed a heavily encrypted anonymous email server and drafted a very short, very precise message directly to Julian's private corporate inbox. I did not use my name. I simply typed, "I know the $4 million commercial loan is entirely fake, and I know Victoria embezzled $2 million from the healthcare network. The federal authorities will be notified on Monday morning." I hit send and watched the tracking software confirm that the email had been opened almost instantly. The reaction was exactly what I had calculated. Maya tapped her laptop screen, showing me the live activity logs from the bank server. Within 3 minutes of opening my anonymous email, Julian initiated an emergency secure connection to Preston Gallagher's private executive terminal. We could not hear their frantic phone conversation, but the digital footprint told the entire story perfectly. Julian was completely melting down. He realized someone was hunting them from the shadows, and he demanded that Preston execute the final offshore wire transfer immediately. He could not wait until next week. He needed the stolen money washed and secured tonight while the party was happening so they could flee the country if the federal agents showed up at their door. Preston had absolutely no choice but to comply with the panicked demands of his desperate brother-in-law. The trap was perfectly set. The final piece of the massive money laundering operation was going to happen under my own roof, surrounded by their wealthy elite friends drinking expensive champagne. I looked at Maya and told her to pack up her computer and get ready for a long night. The old man of the South Side was going home tonight, and I was bringing absolute hell right to their front door. The catering company van smelled like stale bread and cheap cologne. I sat in the back next to Maya, wearing a crisp white button-down shirt, a black vest, and a tight bow tie. I pulled the black catering cap low over my eyes, trying to blend into the shadows of the vehicle. I was 71 years old and returning to the exact same house I built with my own 2 bare hands. But tonight, I was just an invisible servant to the people who had stolen it from me. The van pulled up to the service entrance of my property. The heavy iron gates that I used to paint every single summer were swung wide open. I stepped out into the freezing Chicago night air, carrying a heavy silver tray of imported crystal champagne flutes. Maya walked right behind me, dressed in a matching black uniform, carrying a tray of expensive, tiny appetizers. We kept our heads down and walked right past the private security guards Victoria had hired to patrol the perimeter. The guards did not look twice at us. People like Victoria and her wealthy corporate friends never actually look at the people who serve them food. They only see uniforms. That arrogant elite blindness was exactly what I was counting on tonight. We walked through the side gate and entered the backyard. My breath caught in my throat, and a deep, heavy sorrow hit my chest like a physical blow. My late wife Bea and I had spent 30 years cultivating this beautiful garden. She had planted magnificent oak trees and rows of vibrant blue hydrangeas that bloomed perfectly every spring. We had built a quiet, peaceful sanctuary away from the brutal noise of the city, but Julian and Victoria had completely destroyed it in a matter of days. The ancient oak trees were entirely gone, chopped down to make room for a massive temporary wooden deck covered in cheap, flashy neon lighting and towering outdoor space heaters. The rich soil and the garden beds Bea had tended with such loving care were paved over with cold gray concrete. They had transformed my beautiful home into a tacky, loud nightclub for their elite corporate friends. I walked through the sliding glass doors into the main living room, and the disrespect was absolutely staggering. All of our antique mahogany furniture and the framed family photographs were completely gone, thrown into a dumpster somewhere. In their place, Victoria had rented cheap modern plastic furniture that looked like it belonged in a pretentious modern art museum. The room was packed with hundreds of wealthy investors, corrupt politicians, and banking executives, all laughing loudly and drinking expensive wine. Julian was standing in the center of the room, wearing a custom velvet tuxedo, holding a microphone and boasting about his visionary real estate development project. He was taking full credit for the very ground he was standing on, completely ignoring the fact that he had stolen it from his own father through federal fraud. He talked about tearing down the old useless structures of the past to build a modern wellness center for the future. I gripped my serving tray tightly, keeping my face hidden under the brim of my black cap. I walked right past him, offering glasses of champagne to the laughing guests. He looked right through me. He took a glass of champagne from my tray without even glancing at my face. I was a ghost haunting my own house, and they had absolutely no idea. Maya and I split up near the kitchen doors. She stationed herself near the main electrical panel in the long hallway, pretending to polish silverware while she discreetly monitored the local network traffic on her hidden mobile device. I had a much more dangerous job to do. Maya needed direct, unfiltered access to Julian's private wireless router to intercept the final offshore wire transfer Preston was going to execute tonight. The external bank firewalls were far too strong to hack from the street or the local coffee shop. I had to physically plug a digital cloning drive directly into the back of the physical router itself. I knew exactly where that router was located because I was the one who originally wired the entire house 15 years ago. It was upstairs in my old private study. I slipped away from the crowded, chaotic living room and walked quietly up the back wooden staircase. The heavy thumping bass of the party music muffled the sound of my work boots on the hardwood floor. I reached the end of the long upstairs hallway and pushed open the heavy oak door to my study. The room was dark and smelled like expensive cigars and spilled liquor. Victoria had completely stripped away my old, comfortable leather armchair and my heavy wooden bookshelves, turning the room into a sterile, minimalist modern office for Julian. I walked over to the sleek glass desk sitting in the center of the room. Underneath the desk, sitting on a small metal shelf, was the blinking green light of the master wireless router. I reached into the inside pocket of my black catering vest and pulled out the small digital cloning drive Maya had prepared for me earlier today. I knelt down on the cold hardwood floor, my old joints aching from the sudden movement. I reached behind the router, running my calloused fingers over the warm plastic casing until I found the open serial port. I pushed the silver drive firmly into the slot. A small blue light blinked to life on the device, signaling that it was successfully connected and silently downloading the encryption keys. I just needed to wait exactly 60 seconds for the cloning process to finish before I could pull the drive out and disappear back into the party downstairs. I knelt there in the dark, watching the blue light flashing steadily. 40 seconds remaining. 30 seconds remaining. The silence in the room was suffocating. Then I heard something that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. The heavy, rapid footsteps of two people were walking briskly down the wooden hallway, heading directly toward the closed door of the study. I heard Victoria's sharp voice echoing through the wood. She sounded incredibly angry and completely panicked. She was demanding to know why the money had not been moved yet. I heard Preston Gallagher's deep, arrogant voice responding to her, telling her to keep her voice down before the wealthy guests downstairs heard them arguing. They were coming into the private study to execute the final illegal offshore wire transfer away from the prying eyes of the party. The blue light on my cloning drive was still blinking rapidly. The download was at 90%. I could not pull the drive out without corrupting the files and aborting the entire data breach. The heavy brass doorknob began to turn slowly. I had absolutely no time to grab the drive and escape into the hallway. I rolled silently across the smooth hardwood floor, pushing my body into the narrow, dark shadows of the large wooden supply closet in the far corner of the room. I pulled the louvered doors shut just as the heavy office door swung completely open, hitting the wall with a loud thud. I held my breath, standing perfectly still in the absolute pitch-black darkness of the narrow closet. I could smell the dust and the faint scent of my old winter coats that Victoria had not bothered to throw away yet. I peered through the thin wooden slats of the closet door, praying they would not turn on the main bright overhead lights. Preston walked straight over to the glass desk and opened his laptop while Victoria paced nervously back and forth across the room. I was trapped in the dark, less than 10 feet away from the men who stole my life, waiting for the perfect moment to strike them down. I pressed my back hard against the back wall of the narrow wooden supply closet. The darkness was absolute and completely suffocating. The air smelled of stale dust and the faint lingering scent of cedar from my old winter coats that Victoria had somehow forgotten to throw into the dumpster. My 71-year-old knees ached from crouching in the cramped space, but I forced my body to remain perfectly still. Through the thin wooden slats of the louvered door, I could see narrow horizontal slices of my old study. The heavy oak door to the hallway had just slammed shut completely, cutting off the loud, thumping bass of the lavish party downstairs. Victoria was pacing frantically across the hardwood floor, her expensive high heels clicking sharply with every single agonizing step. She was wearing a stunning designer gown covered in tiny, sparkling jewels, but her face was twisted in an ugly, terrifying mask of pure panic. Preston Gallagher stood right behind her, his custom-tailored suit looking incredibly tight across his broad shoulders. He walked straight over to the glass desk and dropped his heavy leather briefcase onto the smooth surface. He did not turn on the main overhead lights. He only switched on the small brass desk lamp, casting long, dark, ominous shadows across the walls of the room. I reached into the inner pocket of my catering vest, my calloused fingers moving slowly and silently. I pulled out my digital audio recorder and pressed the small red button. A tiny light blinked to life in the palm of my hand. I was standing less than 10 feet away from the two people who had destroyed my life, and I was finally about to capture their ultimate confession. Victoria stopped pacing and turned to face her brother. She was practically vibrating with intense anxiety. She demanded to know why he was taking so long to move the stolen money. She said Julian was downstairs entertaining the wealthy real estate developers right this very second, and they desperately needed the final confirmation that the $2 million was safely washed and sitting in their private offshore account before the night was over. She said the entire demolition deal depended entirely on having that clean, untraceable cash in hand. Preston let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and glared at his sister with absolute pure venom. He told her she was a spoiled, arrogant fool who had absolutely no idea how close they were to losing everything they had ever built. He leaned over the glass desk and his voice dropped to a dangerous, aggressive whisper. He told her that he had received a highly confidential warning from an inside source at the Federal Reserve just 3 hours ago. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was suddenly asking very specific, very dangerous questions about the commercial loan portfolio at his regional bank. He said federal auditors were sniffing around the exact same algorithmic bypass he used to push her fraudulent $4 million loan through the financial system. Victoria gasped loudly, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. She shook her head frantically, saying that was completely impossible. She said they had covered every single track and that the old man was homeless, broke, and entirely powerless. Preston slammed his fist down onto the glass desk so hard I thought the smooth surface would completely shatter into a million pieces. He told her the old man was not the problem anymore. The federal government was the problem. He told her if the FDIC walked into his bank on Monday morning and pulled the raw digital logs, they would both spend the next 20 years rotting in a maximum security federal penitentiary for massive bank fraud and international money laundering. Victoria started to cry heavily. The pristine elite mask she wore for society completely melted away, leaving a terrified, desperate criminal. She stepped toward him, begging him to fix the mess. She said she could not go to prison because she was not built for a concrete cell. She then made a fatal mistake and blamed him, saying it was his arrogant idea to use the offshore Cayman Islands account in the first place. Preston completely snapped. He raised his heavy hand and slapped his own sister viciously across the face. The sharp, violent sound echoed loudly in the dim, suffocating room. Victoria stumbled backward, clutching her red cheek, staring at her brother in absolute shock. Preston pointed a shaking, aggressive finger at her, telling her he only broke the federal banking laws to save her pathetic life after she embezzled $2 million from her own private healthcare network. He told her she was the one who forged her father's signature on the collateral deed, and he was the one risking his entire lucrative career to clean up her massive, dirty mess. I stood completely frozen in the dark closet, the digital recorder capturing every single word of their violent, chaotic confession. They were turning on each other just like rats trapped in a sinking ship. The pressure of the impending federal audit had completely broken their pristine, arrogant facade. Preston turned his back on his crying sister and sat down heavily at the glass desk. He flipped open his secure laptop and aggressively typed in his master password. He told Victoria to shut her mouth and stop crying right now. He said he was logging into the master offshore portal at this exact moment to execute the final wire transfer. He told her once the $2 million crossed the international digital border into the Cayman Islands, the money would be completely untraceable by American authorities, and they could finally burn the physical paper trail forever. I watched through the narrow wooden slats as his fingers flew rapidly across the illuminated keyboard. He was typing the complex authorization codes needed to release the stolen funds. Right beneath his feet, sitting on the small metal shelf under the desk, the blue light of my digital cloning drive was blinking, steadily connected directly to the router he was currently using. Every single keystroke, every hidden password, and every anonymous routing number he typed was being silently duplicated and sent straight to Maya's computer down in the catering van. The digital trap was working flawlessly. The final smoking gun was being handed directly to the federal government. Preston stared intensely at the glowing laptop screen. He muttered under his breath that the banking server was currently processing the international digital handshake. He told Victoria he just needed 30 more seconds for the massive transaction to fully clear the Federal Reserve hurdles. The room was dead silent except for the soft, quiet sound of Victoria's pathetic weeping and the heavy thumping of my own heart. Then a sudden, sharp, vibrating sound completely shattered the silence of the room. It was coming directly from inside my right pocket. It was the daily digital alarm on my burner phone reminding me to take my evening heart medication. I desperately jammed my hand into my pocket trying to turn the device off, but in the dead quiet of the tense study, the rapid buzzing sounded like a blaring police siren. Preston froze instantly. His hands stopped moving completely over the keyboard. He slowly turned his head, looking directly toward the dark corner of the room where the wooden supply closet stood. He did not say a single word. His face went entirely blank with a terrifying, cold realization. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy black handgun. He clicked the safety off with his thumb. The sharp metallic sound echoed terribly in the dark study. He stood up from the glass desk, keeping the weapon raised, and pointed straight ahead and began walking slowly and deliberately right toward the closet door. The vibrating phone in my pocket felt like a massive earthquake shaking my entire body. Preston Gallagher was walking slowly toward the louvered wooden doors of the supply closet, holding a heavy black handgun. I could see the cold steel barrel catching the faint light from the brass desk lamp, illuminating the lethal weapon in the dim room. My 71-year-old heart was hammering furiously against my ribs, but my mind went completely cold and entirely clear. I had spent my entire life working around heavy machinery and highly toxic industrial chemicals on the south side of Chicago. I knew exactly how to survive a dangerous high-pressure situation. I shifted my weight silently in the pitch-black darkness, planting my heavy work boots firmly on the smooth hardwood floor. If he opened that narrow wooden door, I was absolutely not going to beg for my life like a coward. I was going to lunge forward and fight for every single breath I had left. I watched his expensive Italian leather shoes taking slow, deliberate, aggressive steps across my old study. Victoria was standing by the glass desk, trembling uncontrollably, and asking him what he was doing with the weapon. Preston told her to shut her mouth and keep her terrified eyes on the hallway. He reached his left hand out toward the wood. I saw his manicured fingers wrap tightly around the old brass doorknob of the closet. The metal mechanism clicked loudly, echoing in the silent, suffocating room. He was going to pull the door open, and he was going to pull the trigger. I braced my broad shoulders, preparing to throw my entire body weight against the wooden frame. Right at that exact microscopic fraction of a second, a noise so incredibly loud and so violently shattering ripped through the entire second floor of the estate. It sounded like an absolute explosion of pure glass and screaming metal tearing the house apart. The deafening crash echoed violently down the long wooden hallway, completely overpowering the heavy thumping bass of the lavish party music downstairs. Maya had been standing outside the study, carefully monitoring the dangerous situation, and she knew I was trapped in a lethal corner. She had taken a heavy, solid silver serving tray and deliberately smashed it directly into a massive 10-tier crystal champagne tower that Victoria had stupidly placed at the top of the grand staircase as a display of extreme wealth. Hundreds of expensive crystal flutes shattered simultaneously, raining down the wide wooden steps in a chaotic, brilliant waterfall of broken glass and spilling vintage alcohol. The wealthy elite guests downstairs immediately started screaming in absolute shock and pure panic, thinking the house was collapsing. The sheer volume of the destruction was absolutely massive and entirely unexpected. Preston flinched violently, yanking his hand away from the brass closet doorknob as if it had suddenly burned his skin. He spun around, gripping his heavy handgun tightly, his eyes wide with sudden, overwhelming panic. Victoria let out a piercing, terrified shriek, clutching her expensive diamond necklace with both hands. She screamed hysterically that the police must be raiding the house right now. Preston shoved the dangerous handgun aggressively back into his tailored suit jacket and grabbed his sister roughly by the arm. He told her to calm down immediately and act like a normal host. He dragged her out of the private study, rushing frantically down the hallway to see what had just happened, and to desperately protect his arrogant public image in front of his wealthy real estate investors. The heavy oak door to the study swung shut behind them, leaving the room in total, absolute silence once again. I did not waste a single precious second. I burst out of the dark, cramped supply closet, gasping deeply for fresh, cool air. My old muscles ached terribly, and my adrenaline was absolutely surging through my veins like liquid fire. I rushed straight over to the sleek glass desk and dropped heavily to my knees on the hardwood floor. I looked desperately under the small metal shelf where the router was hidden. The digital cloning drive I had plugged into the back of Julian's wireless network was no longer blinking a warning blue. The tiny LED light was glowing a solid bright green, indicating absolute success. The complex data download was 100% complete. Every single encrypted keystroke, every hidden offshore password, and the exact international routing numbers Preston had just typed into his secure laptop had been completely duplicated and safely secured. I reached behind the warm plastic casing and pulled the silver drive out of the open serial port. I slipped the device safely and deeply into the inside pocket of my black catering vest. I stood up quickly and walked silently out of my old study. I moved swiftly down the narrow back servants' staircase, entirely avoiding the chaotic, messy scene of broken crystal and shouting wealthy guests at the front of the house. The elite crowd was completely distracted by the massive, shiny disaster Maya had brilliantly created. I slipped out through the dark kitchen doors and walked straight back out into the freezing Chicago night air, heading toward the dark catering van parked discreetly in the back alleyway. Maya was already sitting safely inside the back of the cold van, breathing heavily, her neat black uniform covered in tiny sticky drops of spilled champagne. I handed her the cold silver cloning drive and she immediately plugged it directly into her secure encrypted laptop. The screen illuminated the dark interior of the van, showing the raw intercepted data streaming perfectly into her advanced decryption software. But then, a massive bright red warning banner flashed urgently across the top of her computer monitor. It was a direct, highly secure message from Director Robert Stanton at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation headquarters in Washington, D.C. The urgent message stated that the Federal Reserve Tracking System had just detected the massive illegal offshore wire transfer. Preston had successfully pushed the execution button right before he ran out of the study. The $2 million of stolen money was currently sitting in a temporary digital clearinghouse hovering securely in cyberspace. The federal message showed a large, bold digital clock counting down exactly 10 minutes until the illicit transaction finalized, and the money vanished permanently into the Cayman Islands beyond American jurisdiction. But Robert Stanton was absolutely not going to let that happen under his watch. The message confirmed that a heavily armed tactical team of 30 federal agents had already completely surrounded the entire perimeter of my sprawling estate. They were hiding quietly in the dark shadows of the Chicago night, waiting in total absolute silence. They had the entire elite, arrogant party completely trapped in an inescapable federal net, but they could not breach the heavy wooden doors until they received my direct authorization. The final countdown had officially started, and the absolute power to completely destroy my son was sitting right at my fingertips. I stood in the freezing shadows of the raised wooden platform that Victoria had rented for the evening entertainment. The professional disc jockey had stepped away for a quick smoke break, leaving his massive electronic mixing console entirely unattended. I slipped off my black catering vest and tossed it into a dark corner of the tent. I was no longer an invisible servant pouring champagne for the arrogant people who robbed me. I was the architect of their absolute destruction. I looked out over the sprawling backyard. The temporary neon lights cast a harsh artificial glow over the cold concrete they had poured directly over my late wife's beautiful garden. Hundreds of wealthy investors, corrupt city officials, and greedy real estate developers were packed tightly into the space, laughing loudly and clinking their expensive crystal flutes. They thought they were attending the glorious birth of a massive commercial empire. They had absolutely no idea they had actually bought front-row tickets to a brutal public execution. I reached deep into my pocket and pulled out the encrypted flash drive containing the raw audio files and the high-resolution scans of the forged bank documents. I plugged the small metal drive directly into the main video projection server sitting right next to the audio mixer. The digital system recognized the files, instantly illuminating a small green light on the console. My calloused hands were perfectly steady. I looked up at the massive outdoor projection screen towering over the wealthy crowd. It was currently displaying a sleek corporate logo for Julian's fake real estate development project. In less than 2 minutes, that glowing screen was going to become the most dangerous and devastating weapon in the entire city of Chicago. The loud thumping electronic music suddenly faded away as a bright white spotlight snapped on, illuminating a small wooden stage in the center of the crowded garden. Julian walked up the short steps wearing his custom velvet tuxedo and a smug, arrogant smile that made my blood boil with a cold, righteous anger. He held a silver microphone in his right hand and a freshly poured glass of vintage champagne in his left. The wealthy elite crowd fell completely silent, turning their undivided attention to the man of the hour. Julian looked out over the sea of expensive suits and designer gowns soaking in their toxic admiration like a parched sponge. He raised his crystal glass high into the freezing cold night air. He thanked everyone for coming out to celebrate what he called a monumental and historic shift in the future of the city. He did not talk about the value of hard work or the dignity of personal sacrifice. He talked entirely about aggressive corporate modernization and eliminating the useless burdens of the past. And then he turned his cruel sights directly on me. He pointed toward the dark silhouette of my house standing quietly behind him in the night. He told the laughing crowd that for decades this piece of prime real estate had been completely wasted on a stubborn, senile old man who foolishly refused to embrace progress. He called my home a rotting, dilapidated shack built on outdated blue-collar mentalities. He told the investors his father was a pathetic relic who did not understand the ruthless nature of modern corporate wealth. Julian bragged that he had finally taken out the garbage. He proudly announced to the clapping audience that early next week, massive steel bulldozers would roll onto this exact property and completely smash the old man's pathetic legacy into 1,000,000 pieces of worthless rubble. He promised them a state-of-the-art commercial wellness center built entirely on the ashes of my entire life. Victoria was standing in the very front row, clapping her hands together rapidly, her eyes shining with pure, unadulterated greed. Preston Gallagher stood right next to her, swirling his dark liquor, looking exactly like an untouchable king who had just conquered a weak, fragile country. Julian told the crowd to direct their attention to the massive outdoor screen. He pulled a small black remote control from his velvet tuxedo pocket and announced he was going to debut the exclusive three-dimensional architectural rendering of their glorious new project. He pressed the button with a sickeningly arrogant flourish. Julian fully expected the massive screen to light up with a beautiful high-definition video of his fake real estate project. He expected the crowd to gasp in absolute awe and immediately shower him with millions of dollars in investments. But I was standing hidden in the dark shadows of the control booth with my hand resting firmly on the master manual override switch. The exact microscopic second Julian pressed his remote control, I slammed the heavy metal switch forward, completely hijacking the video and audio feed. The massive screen flickered violently for a brief moment, bathing the entire backyard in a harsh, blinding white light. Then the image snapped into razor-sharp focus. It was absolutely not a colorful architectural rendering of a wellness center. It was a massive, high-resolution scan of the highly illegal $4 million commercial loan contract. The document was magnified so incredibly large that every single wealthy investor in the backyard could clearly and easily read the confidential federal banking letterhead. The screen automatically zoomed in, panning slowly down to the bottom right corner of the legal contract. A bright, pulsing red circle appeared on the screen, highlighting two very specific and damning items. The first was my forged signature, completely blown up for the entire world to see. The second was the official banking authorization stamp belonging directly to Preston Gallagher. The massive crowd of elite socialites and corporate executives went completely dead silent. A sudden, overwhelming wave of confusion rippled through the freezing night air. People started pointing at the towering screen, squinting their eyes, trying to understand why Julian was broadcasting a highly confidential federal banking document in the middle of a lavish celebration. Julian stood completely frozen on the wooden stage, his smug, arrogant smile entirely vanishing from his face. He stared up at the massive screen, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly like a fish pulled out of the water. He frantically mashed the buttons on his small black remote control, trying desperately to shut the projector off, but his little device was completely useless. I had entirely locked him out of the main system. Julian shouted wildly at the private security guards, demanding they cut the electrical power to the stage immediately. But before a single guard could even take a step forward, I pushed the master audio fader all the way up to the absolute maximum level. The towering concert speakers surrounding the garden suddenly crackled with intense, heavy static. Then Julian's own voice boomed across the entire estate, echoing loudly into the dark sky. It was the crystal-clear audio recording I had expertly captured at the downtown coffee shop. The massive speakers blasted his arrogant confession at a deafening volume. Everyone heard Julian laughing mockingly. Everyone heard him clearly say, "Preston is the vice president of commercial lending. His bank legitimized everything. He bypassed the algorithmic risk assessment. He manually authorized the funds and pushed the collateral through the system under a corporate exemption shell. We washed the money clean before the sun came up." The incredibly loud audio echoed violently against the brick walls of my house. The wealthy crowd gasped in pure, unified horror. The elite investors who had just praised him incredibly highly suddenly physically backed away from the stage as if Julian was completely infected with a highly contagious, deadly disease. Preston Gallagher dropped his drink, his face turning chalk white as he realized his entire massive federal crime was just broadcasted to hundreds of powerful, influential witnesses. Victoria let out a pathetic, horrified whimper, covering her face with her trembling hands. Julian stood trembling violently on the stage, his custom velvet tuxedo suddenly feeling like a suffocating straitjacket. The crystal champagne flute slipped right through his numb, sweaty fingers and shattered violently on the wooden floorboards, completely drowning in the deafening sound of his own recorded voice confessing to federal treason. The ultimate public execution had officially begun, and the entire world was watching his arrogant empire bleed out on the floor. The audio of Julian confessing to massive federal bank fraud continued to loop through the towering concert speakers, echoing violently against the brick walls of my home. The wealthy elite guests were completely paralyzed, standing frozen on the cold concrete. I stepped out from the dark shadows of the control booth and walked directly into the harsh glare of the neon lighting. I reached up and pulled the cheap black catering cap off my head, dropping it onto the ground that used to be my late wife's beautiful garden. I unbuttoned the tight black catering vest and let it fall to the floor. I was no longer hiding in the background. I walked slowly and deliberately through the sea of expensive custom suits and glittering designer gowns. The massive crowd of wealthy investors and corrupt city politicians parted for me like the Red Sea. They looked at my calloused hands and my weathered face, suddenly recognizing the man Julian had just mocked on the massive projection screen. I kept my spine perfectly straight and my eyes locked dead ahead on the wooden stage. Julian was standing absolutely frozen on the raised wooden platform. His custom velvet tuxedo was completely soaked with the vintage champagne he had just dropped. He looked down at me approaching the short steps, and the last remaining drops of blood entirely drained from his arrogant face. He looked exactly like a terrified little boy who had just been caught stealing from a burning house. Victoria was standing at the edge of the stage, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute pure horror. She finally realized the old blue-collar worker she threw out into the freezing rain had systematically and ruthlessly dismantled her entire pristine elite world. I walked up the wooden steps, my heavy work boots thudding loudly against the floorboards. Julian took a stumbling step backward, his mouth opening and closing repeatedly, but absolutely no sound came out. He was completely suffocating on his own arrogant lies. I walked right up to him. I did not yell, and I did not raise my hand to strike him. I simply reached out and took the silver microphone directly from his trembling, sweaty fingers. I turned my back on my pathetic son and looked out over the massive crowd of wealthy investors and influential city officials. The entire backyard was so incredibly quiet you could hear the freezing Chicago wind blowing through the temporary wooden structures. I raised the microphone to my mouth. I spoke in a low, steady voice that carried the absolute heavy weight of 30 years of hard labor and relentless survival. I said thank you all for coming out tonight to celebrate the massive federal crimes of my only son. A collective shocked gasp rippled through the hundreds of people standing in my backyard. I pointed up at the massive projection screen that was still displaying the forged federal banking document and the highly illegal offshore routing numbers. I told the crowd that the visionary real estate project they were invited to fund tonight was an absolute total illusion. I explained that the ground they were standing on was stolen from me using a forged medical power of attorney and a fraudulent $4 million commercial loan. I looked directly at the wealthy corporate developers standing in the front row and told them that Julian and Victoria were secretly using their blind investments to wash dirty, embezzled money through an anonymous Cayman Islands offshore account. I told the entire city elite that they were currently drinking expensive champagne funded entirely by federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering. The crowd erupted into chaotic, panicked whispers. Wealthy socialites began physically backing away toward the garden exits, absolutely terrified of being associated with a massive federal criminal conspiracy. Corporate investors pulled out their mobile phones, frantically typing messages to their legal teams. The pristine, perfect image Julian and Victoria had spent years meticulously building was entirely reduced to toxic radioactive ash in less than 3 minutes. Victoria collapsed onto her knees on the edge of the stage, sobbing hysterically as the wealthy wives who had praised her just an hour ago now looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. Julian was hyperventilating, grabbing his own hair and staring at the projection screen as if it was a terrible nightmare he could not wake up from. But down in the crowd, Preston Gallagher was completely losing his mind. He was standing near the expensive outdoor bar, and he watched his entire lucrative banking career, his pristine reputation, and his personal freedom absolutely evaporate in front of hundreds of powerful, influential witnesses. He knew the federal government was going to tear his life apart. He knew the digital footprint on that screen meant a mandatory 20-year prison sentence in a maximum security facility. The immense pressure completely snapped his sanity. He pushed violently through the thick crowd of panicked investors, knocking a wealthy elderly woman onto the cold concrete floor. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his face twisted in a violently ugly and desperate rage. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger at me and shouted for the private security guards to arrest the crazy old man immediately. He screamed that I was a homeless, trespassing lunatic who had hacked the audio system with fake documents. He desperately tried to convince the panicked crowd that everything on the massive screen was a sophisticated lie designed by a bitter, estranged father. He ordered the guards to tackle me to the ground and drag me off the property right this very second. But the heavy private security guards did not move a single inch. They were hired to protect a networking event, not to intervene in a massive federal banking crime. They saw the official federal documents glowing brightly on the screen, and they heard the undeniable audio confession booming through the speakers. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the toxic fallout. They stepped back and let Preston scream into the freezing void. Preston realized absolutely nobody was going to help him cover up his massive crimes. He realized the exits were becoming blocked by the sheer mass of panicked, wealthy guests trying to flee the property. He looked up at me standing calmly on the wooden stage holding the microphone. The sheer hatred in his eyes was completely blinding. He reached inside his expensive tailored suit jacket and did the most desperate, foolish thing a cornered, white-collar criminal could ever do. He pulled out a heavy black handgun right in the middle of the crowded party. The collective scream from the crowd was absolutely deafening. Hundreds of wealthy people dropped their expensive drinks and scrambled violently over the plastic furniture, trying to escape the immediate line of fire. Women in designer gowns fell to the floor, covering their heads, while corporate executives trampled over the manicured lawn to reach the iron gates. Preston ignored the absolute chaos erupting all around him. He raised the heavy, lethal weapon and pointed the dark steel barrel directly at my chest. He was breathing heavily, his eyes completely wild and manic. He told me I had ruined his entire life, and that he was going to make sure I never lived to see the federal agents arrive. He clicked the safety off with his thumb, the sharp metallic sound cutting through the hysterical screaming of the crowd. I stood perfectly still on the stage, looking directly down the barrel of the gun, feeling absolutely no fear, because I knew he was already entirely out of time. The heavy, cold steel barrel of the handgun was pointed directly at my chest. Preston Gallagher stood just 20 feet away, breathing heavily like a cornered and desperate wild animal. The wealthy socialites and corrupt city politicians who had spent the entire evening drinking expensive champagne and mocking my existence were now crawling on their hands and knees across the cold concrete patio. Women in stunning designer gowns were weeping openly and trampling over each other to escape the immediate line of fire. I stood completely still on the raised wooden stage. I did not raise my hands in surrender, and I absolutely did not beg for my life. I looked straight down the dark barrel of that lethal weapon, and I felt an overwhelming freezing calm wash over my entire body. Preston was shaking so violently that he could barely hold the heavy weapon straight. He was a privileged, arrogant bank executive who had spent his entire life hiding behind expensive lawyers and manipulating numbers on a secure computer screen. He was absolutely not a killer. He was just a terrified coward who had finally run out of lies to tell the world. He screamed at me, his voice cracking with pure absolute panic, ordering me to get down on the ground and turn off the massive projection screen immediately. He actually thought he could still control the narrative. He foolishly believed that a single bullet would somehow magically erase the massive federal wire fraud that was currently broadcasting to the entire city of Chicago. I looked him dead in his terrified eyes and told him that he was completely out of time. Before Preston could even attempt to tighten his trembling finger on the metal trigger, the entire freezing night sky above my estate suddenly exploded with a blinding, terrifying light. It was absolutely not the cheap artificial glow of Victoria's tacky neon party decorations. It was a massive military-grade halogen spotlight cutting through the dark Chicago wind like a solid, heavy pillar of pure white fire. The intense beam hit the center of the backyard with such absolute overwhelming force that it cast long, harsh, dark shadows across the concrete patio. A tiny fraction of a second later, the deafening rhythmic thumping of heavy helicopter rotors entirely swallowed the chaotic screaming of the wealthy crowd. A massive federal tactical chopper hovered just a few hundred feet above the old, towering oak trees, blowing a violent hurricane of cold air and flying debris directly across the lavish, expensive party. The intense, heavy downdraft sent the cheap plastic modern furniture flying violently across the yard and shattered the few remaining crystal champagne flutes into fine, glowing dust. A booming, mechanically amplified voice echoed from the dark sky, completely drowning out the loud party music and Julian's recorded confession that was still looping on the speakers. The massive voice ordered every single person on the property to drop to the ground immediately and place their hands flat behind their heads. Preston froze in absolute pure terror. The heavy black handgun slipped effortlessly from his weak, trembling grip and clattered loudly onto the cold concrete floor. The blinding white spotlight from the helicopter was tracking him perfectly, locking him in a glowing, inescapable circle of absolute federal authority. He shielded his eyes against the massive, blinding glare, finally realizing that his pristine, untouchable elite world was entirely crashing down around him in real time. The heavy wrought iron gates at the very front of my sprawling estate were violently smashed open with a deafening metallic crash that shook the ground. I stood tall on the wooden stage and watched as 3 heavily armored black tactical vans tore aggressively up the long, winding driveway, tearing deep, muddy trenches into the perfectly manicured front lawn. Dozens of highly trained federal agents wearing thick, dark body armor and carrying heavy tactical rifles poured out of the armored vehicles like a highly organized, terrifying swarm of angry hornets. The bright yellow letters spelling FBI were boldly emblazoned across their broad, armored chests. They moved with absolute flawless military precision, sweeping quickly through the dark side gardens and completely flooding the massive backyard in a matter of seconds. The wealthy elite investors who were just drinking imported vintage champagne and loudly laughing at my expense were now lying flat on the cold, wet grass, sobbing hysterically and covering their heads in pure, absolute panic. The beautiful illusion of their high society superiority was entirely shattered by the crushing reality of federal law enforcement. Julian suddenly snapped out of his frozen, terrified shock and made the most pathetic, cowardly decision of his entire miserable life. He did not run over to protect his wife. He did not stand his ground like a real man. He turned his back on his own family and blindly sprinted toward the dark back edge of the large property, desperately hoping to jump the tall wooden privacy fence and disappear completely into the freezing Chicago night. But his expensive running shoes and his arrogant private gym workouts were absolutely useless against highly trained federal tactical agents. He did not even make it 10 yards across the lawn. A massive federal agent easily intercepted his frantic path, launching forward and tackling Julian violently to the manicured turf. Julian's expensive custom velvet tuxedo was instantly completely ruined, smeared with dark, freezing mud and torn, wet grass. He hit the ground incredibly hard, crying out in sharp physical pain as the heavy agent expertly twisted his arms firmly behind his back and locked a pair of heavy, cold steel handcuffs securely around his wrists. The arrogant tech startup founder who had cruelly thrown his own father out into the freezing rain on Thanksgiving dinner was now weeping loudly into the dirty mud, begging the federal agents not to hurt him and promising to cooperate completely. Over by the outdoor bar, Victoria was completely falling apart. She was standing near the shattered remains of her massive crystal champagne tower, sobbing uncontrollably and screaming wildly for someone to call her expensive private lawyers. Her stunning designer gown was totally covered in spilled, sticky alcohol and dark, muddy footprints from the panicked, fleeing crowd. Her perfectly styled hair was a wild, tangled mess, and her expensive makeup was running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She dropped heavily to her knees on the cold patio, throwing a massive, hysterical, childish tantrum right in front of the advancing federal agents. She screamed at the top of her lungs that she was an innocent victim, that her brother and her husband had violently forced her into the massive embezzlement scheme, and that she had absolutely no idea where the $2 million of stolen money went. But the federal agents did not care about her expensive tears or her pathetic, desperate lies. 2 female officers pulled her roughly to her feet, pinning her arms tightly behind her back and snapping the cold steel cuffs onto her trembling wrists. She kicked and thrashed her legs like a spoiled, angry child, but she was entirely powerless against the crushing absolute weight of the federal justice system. Down on the cold concrete patio, Preston Gallagher realized he was completely, totally surrounded. He looked up at the massive helicopter spotlight glaring intensely down at him, and then looked frantically at the dozens of armed agents rapidly swarming the entire yard. In a final act of pure, desperate stupidity, he turned and sprinted wildly toward the sliding glass doors of my house, hoping to barricade himself safely inside my old private study. But right as he reached the wooden back deck, the heavy glass doors violently shattered inward. A fully armed federal SWAT team had already successfully breached the front of the house and was pouring out into the backyard to meet him head-on. 5 heavily armored officers slammed their thick tactical shields directly into Preston's chest, throwing the arrogant, corrupt bank executive violently backward onto the hard wooden floorboards. They swarmed aggressively over him, pressing his face hard against the cold, wet wood, shouting aggressive, authoritative commands for him to stop resisting immediately. I stood perfectly calm and completely silent on the raised wooden stage, watching the absolute flawless execution of pure federal justice. Every single possible escape route was permanently, completely sealed. Every arrogant lie was completely and publicly exposed. The massive criminal empire they had foolishly tried to build on the foundation of my stolen home was completely eradicated in less than 5 minutes. The massive federal tactical helicopter finally banked away from the estate, letting the deafening roar of the heavy rotors fade into the dark, freezing Chicago night. But the absolute chaos on the ground was just beginning to reach its boiling point. The blinding white searchlights from the tactical vans were now completely illuminating the ruined backyard. The wealthy elite guests, the corrupt politicians, and the arrogant real estate developers who had spent the entire evening drinking expensive vintage champagne were now standing in huddled, terrified groups surrounded by heavily armed federal agents. Nobody was allowed to leave the property. They were all material witnesses to a massive international money laundering conspiracy. I stood perfectly still on the raised wooden stage, leaning slightly against the cold metal scaffolding. I watched the 3 people who had callously thrown me out into the freezing rain on Thanksgiving turn on each other with the absolute viciousness of starving wild animals trapped in a cage. Victoria was the very first one to completely snap. Her expensive designer gown was torn and covered in sticky spilled alcohol and dark wet mud. The flawless, pristine socialite mask she wore to country clubs and elite charity galas entirely melted away, leaving behind a pathetic, terrified coward. 2 female federal agents were pulling her roughly to her feet, snapping the cold steel handcuffs tightly around her wrists. Victoria looked around wildly at the horrified faces of her wealthy friends, and she made her desperate move. She did not look at her husband with love or solidarity. She pointed her trembling, manicured finger directly at Julian, who was currently being dragged out of the muddy grass by 2 massive tactical officers. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with pure hysterical panic. She yelled to the federal agents and the wealthy crowd that it was all Julian. She screamed that he was a manipulative liar who had completely tricked his own elderly father out of the house. She sobbed loudly, putting on a pathetic theatrical performance, claiming she was just an innocent, naive wife who had absolutely no idea where the $4 million came from. She swore to the federal investigators that Julian had entirely forged the medical power of attorney behind her back, and that she was completely horrified by his massive criminal actions. She was throwing the man she married directly under the heavy wheels of the federal justice system just to save her own expensive skin. Julian heard every single word she screamed. He was standing covered in thick, freezing mud, his custom velvet tuxedo completely ruined, and his hands locked firmly behind his back. The absolute shock on his face quickly morphed into a violent, explosive rage. The beautiful, flawless illusion of their high society marriage completely shattered into a million sharp, jagged pieces right there on the wet concrete patio. Julian lunged forward aggressively, fighting against the strong grip of the federal agents holding him back. He screamed right back at his wife, his voice completely raw and echoing with pure, unadulterated hatred. He called her a toxic, greedy parasite. He yelled for the entire wealthy crowd and the federal agents to hear that Victoria was a massive corporate thief. He screamed that she had illegally embezzled $2 million from her own private healthcare network to fund her lavish, arrogant lifestyle. He told everyone standing in the backyard that she had aggressively threatened to file for an immediate divorce and completely ruin his startup company if he did not steal his own father's house to cover up her massive, dirty financial crimes. He cried tears of pure, bitter frustration, shouting that he had destroyed his entire family and sold his own soul just to keep her out of a concrete prison cell, and this was how she repaid him. They were publicly tearing each other to shreds, completely exposing every single dark, disgusting secret they had hidden behind their massive iron gates and expensive luxury cars. Over by the shattered sliding glass doors, Preston Gallagher was being forcefully hauled to his feet by the heavily armored federal SWAT team. His face was scraped and bleeding from being violently shoved onto the hard wooden floorboards. He was the corrupt, untouchable vice president of commercial lending, but right now he looked exactly like a common street criminal. He listened to his sister and his brother-in-law screaming their complete confessions across the freezing yard, and he absolutely lost his mind. He spat blood onto the deck and began cursing at both of them with a dark, vicious fury. He yelled that they were both incredibly stupid, pathetic amateurs who had entirely ruined his flawless banking career. He screamed that he had meticulously built an untraceable international offshore money laundering system to save their miserable lives, and they had completely ruined it with their arrogant, careless mistakes. He cursed Victoria for being a greedy thief, and he cursed Julian for being a weak, cowardly fool who could not even control his own elderly father. He yelled that he was going to make sure they both rotted in maximum security solitary confinement for the rest of their pathetic natural lives. The three of them stood in the blinding tactical lights, completely surrounded by heavily armed officers screaming vicious, toxic insults at each other while the elite society of Chicago watched in absolute total disgust. The federal agents finally had enough of the chaotic public screaming match. Special Agent Robert Stanton gave a swift, sharp nod from the command van. The tactical officers aggressively pushed Julian, Victoria, and Preston forward, marching them roughly across the wet grass toward the waiting armored transport vehicles. This was not a quiet, discreet, white-collar arrest. This was the ultimate public walk of shame. The wealthy investors and elite politicians physically backed away, turning their faces in absolute disgust as the three criminals were paraded right past them. The people who had just been drinking their imported champagne and praising their visionary real estate project now looked at them like they were highly infectious diseases. But the absolute worst part of their nightmare was waiting for them just outside the front gates of the estate. The sheer massive scale of the sudden federal raid and the noisy helicopters had completely alerted the local Chicago news stations. Dozens of aggressive reporters and mobile camera crews had already swarmed the entire front perimeter of the property. The exact second Julian, Victoria, and Preston were dragged out of the gates, a massive, blinding ocean of white camera flashes violently erupted in the dark, freezing night. The bright strobe lights from the press cameras illuminated their tear-stained, muddy faces for the entire world to see. Reporters shoved heavy microphones aggressively toward their faces, shouting rapid questions about the $4 million forged loan and the Cayman Islands offshore accounts. Victoria tried desperately to hide her face behind her messy, tangled hair, sobbing hysterically as the harsh camera flashes captured her complete, ultimate humiliation. She was a woman who had lived her entire life completely obsessed with her pristine public image, and now she was going to be the absolute prime target of every single front-page news story in the entire country. Julian kept his head bowed, staring blankly down at the freezing wet pavement, completely broken and entirely empty. He realized that the flashing cameras were permanently recording his massive failure. He had traded the unconditional love of a hard-working father for a completely fake elite world that had just chewed him up and spit him out into the freezing mud. Preston was forcefully shoved into the back of a dark federal transport van, his arrogant curses muffled by the heavy reinforced steel doors slamming completely shut. I stood quietly on the raised wooden stage, watching the flashing red and blue police lights reflecting off the dark, distant trees. I did not walk down to gloat in their faces. I did not need to scream or boast about my massive victory. The devastating silence of my final move had already spoken louder than any arrogant words ever could. The wealthy crowd of investors was slowly being processed and escorted off my property by the federal agents, leaving the ruined backyard entirely empty and completely quiet. The cold Chicago wind blew through the torn plastic decorations and the shattered crystal glass scattered across the concrete floor. The toxic parasites had been aggressively cut out of my life forever. They thought they could step on the back of an old blue-collar worker to reach the very top of their artificial mountain, but they completely forgot that the men who pour the concrete foundations are the exact same men who know how to expertly demolish the entire building. The night was finally over, and the air in my home was completely clean once again. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago swung open, and I walked into the massive room wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal wool suit. It had been exactly 6 months since the freezing night the tactical helicopters descended on my backyard and completely shattered the arrogant illusion my son had built. The wheels of federal justice turn incredibly slowly for common street criminals, but when you involve the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and international offshore money laundering, the federal prosecutors move with the absolute terrifying speed of a bullet train. There were no long, drawn-out legal delays, and there were absolutely no secret backdoor plea deals. The Department of Justice wanted to make a massive public example out of the corrupt banking executives who thought they could treat the American financial system like their own personal piggy bank. I sat down in the front row of the polished wooden gallery and folded my hands patiently in my lap. I looked across the wide courtroom and watched the heavy side door open. Julian, Victoria, and Preston were slowly marched into the bright courtroom by 3 armed federal marshals. They were no longer wearing their expensive custom velvet tuxedos or their stunning $20,000 designer gowns. They were completely stripped of their elite high society armor. All 3 of them were wearing loose-fitting bright orange federal prison jumpsuits. Their wrists were locked in heavy cold steel handcuffs attached to thick chains that wrapped securely around their waists, and their ankles were shackled together, forcing them to take small, shuffling, pathetic steps. The physical and psychological toll of sitting in a cold, concrete federal holding cell for the past 6 months had absolutely ruined them. Julian had lost a significant amount of weight and his hair was thinning rapidly from the intense, suffocating stress. He kept his head bowed, entirely unable to look me in the eye. Victoria looked completely unrecognizable. Her flawless, expensive makeup and her perfectly styled hair were entirely gone, leaving behind a pale, exhausted woman who finally looked exactly like the desperate, greedy criminal she truly was. Preston Gallagher, the former untouchable vice president of commercial lending, walked with a heavy slump in his shoulders, his arrogant pride completely broken by the crushing weight of the federal government. The trial was incredibly fast and brutally efficient. The elite, expensive defense lawyers that Victoria had desperately hired using her parents' money were completely and utterly useless. You can manipulate witnesses and you can twist emotional testimonies, but you absolutely cannot argue with irrefutable digital mathematics. The lead federal prosecutor stood in front of the silent courtroom and laid out the entire massive criminal conspiracy with surgical precision. He presented the digital data Maya and I had successfully extracted from the restricted basement archives and the wireless router. The massive courtroom monitors displayed the exact same high-resolution scans of the forged collateral documents and the highly illegal Cayman Islands offshore routing numbers. The prosecution brought in expert forensic accountants from the FDIC who clearly testified that Preston had manually bypassed the algorithmic risk assessments to wash $2 million of stolen money across international borders. They presented the undeniable audio recording of Julian laughing arrogantly and confessing to the entire criminal operation over a cup of expensive coffee. The overwhelming mountain of concrete physical evidence completely suffocated their defense, leaving their highly paid lawyers with absolutely nothing to say. The federal judge presiding over the case was a stern older man who had absolutely zero tolerance for wealthy white-collar predators. He looked down at the 3 defendants standing in their orange jumpsuits, and his face was a mask of pure, absolute disgust. He addressed the quiet courtroom and stated clearly that their actions were a despicable, sickening display of unchecked corporate greed and severe elder abuse. He said they had maliciously weaponized the federal banking system to steal a home from a hard-working elderly man just to cover up a massive corporate embezzlement scandal. He did not grant them a single ounce of leniency or mercy. The judge gripped his heavy wooden gavel and delivered the final devastating blow. He sentenced Preston Gallagher to a mandatory 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for mastermind bank fraud, international money laundering, and criminal conspiracy. Preston collapsed heavily into his wooden chair, covering his face as the reality of dying in a concrete cell finally washed over him. The judge then turned his cold, furious gaze toward my son and my daughter-in-law. He sentenced Julian and Victoria to 15 years each in federal prison for aggravated wire fraud conspiracy to commit financial theft and severe felony elder abuse. Victoria let out a loud, piercing wail of pure despair, violently fighting against her heavy steel chains as the federal marshals grabbed her arms to drag her away. Julian just stood there, completely frozen, staring blankly at the polished wooden floor, entirely destroyed by his own pathetic, cowardly choices. But the swift, brutal sword of federal justice did not just stop with the 3 individuals standing in the courtroom. Director Robert Stanton and his elite team of 30 federal examiners completely eradicated the root of the toxic infection. The FDIC officially declared Preston's regional commercial bank to be a structurally compromised and corrupt financial institution. The federal government moved aggressively and immediately seized entire total control of the massive bank. They fired the entire executive board, froze all high-risk commercial assets, and placed the institution under strict, absolute federal receivership. The arrogant bankers who had turned a blind eye to Preston's highly illegal activities were permanently stripped of their financial licenses and forced out into the street. The toxic, corrupt system that had allowed them to forge my signature and steal my home was completely dismantled and sterilized by the highest financial authorities in the country. As the chaotic sentencing came to a close, the federal prosecutor approached the judge's bench with one final piece of critical legal paperwork. Because the $4 million commercial loan was officially declared by the Department of Justice to be the direct product of a massive federal criminal fraud, the presiding judge entirely nullified the original contract. He stated firmly for the official court record that a contract built entirely on forgery and criminal deceit has absolutely no legal standing in the United States of America. He completely voided the fraudulent foreclosure notice and legally shredded the massive debt Julian had tried to bury me under. The judge signed a permanent binding executive order immediately restoring the original title and the clean legal deed of my sprawling estate directly back to my name. I did not lose a single penny to the corrupt banking syndicate. I did not have to pay a single expensive legal fee to fight the fraudulent foreclosure because the federal government had done all the heavy lifting for me. The massive criminal debt was entirely erased, completely vanishing into thin air as if it had never even existed. The federal marshals escorted the weeping, broken criminals out through the heavy side doors of the courtroom, leading them directly to the armored transport buses waiting in the underground garage to take them to their permanent concrete cages. I stood up from the polished wooden bench and buttoned my custom charcoal jacket. I walked slowly and calmly down the center aisle of the quiet federal courtroom, leaving the dark, painful chapter of my life completely behind me. I pushed the heavy glass doors open and stepped out into the bright, warm Chicago sunlight, a completely free and entirely victorious man, holding the absolute permanent deed to my home safely in my pocket. The brutal, freezing Chicago winter finally surrendered, giving way to a bright and incredibly warm spring morning. I stood in the absolute center of my sprawling backyard wearing my old faded flannel shirt and my heavy work boots. The massive, ugly wooden deck and the cheap, flashy neon lights that Julian and Victoria had erected for their arrogant celebration were completely gone. I had personally hired a heavy industrial demolition crew to tear down every single piece of their toxic vanity project and aggressively haul the garbage away to the city dump where it truly belonged. The cold gray concrete they had callously poured over my late wife's beautiful garden had been violently jackhammered and entirely removed, revealing the rich, dark, natural soil underneath. I spent the last 3 weeks working from sunrise to sunset on my hands and knees, pulling out the broken debris and meticulously replanting the vibrant blue hydrangeas Bea had always loved more than anything else. I brought in massive, mature oak trees using heavy transport trucks to replace the beautiful ancient ones they had so selfishly chopped down. My old muscles ached with the familiar heavy fatigue of honest physical labor, but my soul felt completely light and entirely free. The house was no longer a chaotic crime scene, and it was absolutely no longer a vulnerable target for greedy, arrogant parasites. It was my quiet, peaceful sanctuary once again. I painted the heavy wrought iron gates at the front of the property, ensuring every single rusted spot was covered with fresh, thick black paint. I repaired the shattered sliding glass doors and replaced the cheap, modern plastic furniture with heavy, solid mahogany pieces that actually felt like a real home. Every single swing of my hammer and every single shovel of dirt was a deliberate, conscious act of reclaiming my own life. I was 71 years old, and I was completely rebuilding my kingdom from the ground up exactly the way I wanted it, piece by piece and day by day. As I finished packing the fresh, dark soil around the deep roots of a newly planted oak tree, I heard the familiar crunch of gravel coming from the long, winding front driveway. I stood up slowly, stretching my aching back, and wiped the dark dirt from my calloused hands using an old rag. Maya was walking up the stone path toward the sunny backyard. She was absolutely no longer the terrified junior credit officer I had cornered in a dark, damp parking garage 6 months ago. She was walking with her spine perfectly straight, projecting absolute, unwavering confidence and undeniable professional authority. She was wearing a sharp, tailored navy blue business suit and carrying a slim, expensive leather briefcase. I smiled warmly and walked over to the wooden back patio. I poured 2 large cups of hot black coffee from a heavy silver thermos and handed one directly to her. We stood side by side in the warm sunlight, looking out over the newly restored blooming garden. I told her that the federal government had officially finalized the total permanent liquidation of Preston Gallagher's corrupt commercial bank yesterday afternoon. The toxic financial institution was completely dismantled piece by piece, and the stolen assets were safely redistributed to fully protect the innocent, hardworking account holders. Maya took a slow, deliberate sip of her hot coffee and smiled a genuine, bright smile. She told me she had just come from a massive, highly secure orientation meeting in downtown Chicago. When the chaotic dust had finally settled from the massive federal raid, I had made a very specific, highly confidential phone call to my old friend, Director Robert Stanton, at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation headquarters. I told Robert that he desperately needed a brilliant, fearless financial mind who knew exactly how arrogant, corrupt executives hid their dirty money behind complex digital firewalls. I strongly recommended Maya for a high-level senior position as a federal banking inspector. Robert had personally reviewed her flawless execution of the highly dangerous data heist, and he hired her on the absolute spot with a massive starting salary. She looked at me, her eyes shining with deep, genuine gratitude, and promised me she would spend the rest of her entire professional career aggressively tearing down the exact same kind of arrogant, wealthy predators who had foolishly tried to destroy us. I watched Maya walk back down the long driveway, her future incredibly bright and completely secure. I turned around and walked up the short wooden steps to my large back porch. I sat down heavily in my old, comfortable wooden rocking chair, resting my heavy work boots on the painted wooden railing. I took a slow, deep sip of my dark, bitter coffee, letting the rich, familiar warmth settle deep into my chest. The morning air was perfectly still and completely quiet, entirely free from the toxic noise of greedy relatives and arrogant high society elites. I thought about Julian and Victoria waking up this exact same morning inside their cold, damp concrete federal prison cells. They were completely stripped of their expensive designer clothes, their luxury imported cars, and their completely false high society superiority. They would spend the next 15 years of their miserable lives staring at gray steel bars, eating bland prison food, and entirely forgotten by the wealthy elite friends they had desperately tried to impress. I felt absolutely no regret, no guilt, and absolutely no sorrow for my only son. I had spent 40 long, hard years trying to give him the entire world, and he had violently tried to push me into an early grave just to steal it faster. He made his arrogant, cowardly choice, and now he was paying the absolute ultimate heavy price. The massive, suffocating storm had completely passed. The toxic, deadly infection had been aggressively surgically cut out, and my sprawling estate was entirely clean. I looked out over the vibrant, blooming garden and the strong, heavy oak trees standing incredibly tall in the bright, warm sunlight. I had fiercely protected my legacy. I had secured my permanent, absolute peace, and I had entirely eliminated the ruthless traitors from my life without compromising a single ounce of my own dignity or my personal honor. A home is not just a structure of wood and brick. It is the physical manifestation of a lifetime of honest labor and unconditional sacrifice. When a child chooses greed over gratitude, they do not just steal property, they bankrupt their own soul. True wealth is never found in fraudulent contracts or stolen inheritances. It resides in the unwavering dignity of a person who knows their own worth. You can strip a man of his possessions, but you can never steal his resilience. Blood may give you family, but character dictates whether you deserve them. If this story resonated with you and you believe that respect and character are far more important than simple bloodlines, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and ultimate karma. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.